Horror has been one of the most popular genres of video games pretty much for as long as they've been around. Decades of trends have come and gone. In the early 2010s, there were creepypastas like the Slenderman game, and a couple years later, cutesy psychological horror came along with Doki Doki Literature Club and Omori everywhere. Some lasted longer than others, with Five Nights at Freddy's celebrating our 10-year anniversary just last year, and others really only capture players' attention for a few months, like Liminal Spaces, Anomaly Horror, or those Stalker horror games from Chilla's Art, Puppet Combos, and similar developers. I love them all, and there are plenty of people that agree. However, one of the most memorable phases within the horror genre, though, started in the late 90s and early 2000s. Games like Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, and Forbidden Siren started to quickly form a movement of mysterious psychological horror games, often drawing inspiration from Japanese horror and putting emphasis on the aesthetics and atmosphere of their games. Even decades after this trend started, it still maintains a cult following. Many of the games are still considered some of the best video games to be made yet, with remakes and movie adaptations reviving their popularity every few years. But how have they stayed so timeless? In my opinion, much of the credit should be given to the theming within these games and how it builds up on their cohesiveness. Sure, psychological and survival horror was the trend back then, much like mascot and anomaly horror is in more recent times, but many late 2000s games took their theme concepts to the next level. If I didn't sound too pretentious, I'd even consider it a movement within the video game sphere, a Gothic renaissance. When I say that many of the horror games in the 2000s formed a Gothic renaissance, I don't mean through architecture or subculture, but I specifically mean that most of the main elements in these games, the themes, the setting, the characters, match really closely to Gothic literature. The Gothic lit movement lasted for decades, and there are multiple subgenres that lasted even longer, but the core aspects of it can be simplified into a short list. Firstly, one of the most important parts of what makes a Gothic story is the setting. More often than not, they take place in creepy, mysterious castles or mansions. They're also really likely to be old or abandoned. Secret passages, hidden rooms, underground cells, old paintings in the attic, stuff like that. The setting also helps build up a suspenseful or eerie atmosphere, which can serve as metaphors or allegories for the horror and sorrow within the story. Kind of like when it rains during a funeral scene to make the scene even more sad in movies. They really left metaphors during the Gothic era and allegories and juxtapositions. To take inspiration from the Romantic movement that started a little earlier, Gothic lit also featured a lot of heightened emotions and drama, as well as more supernatural events like omens or visions, prophecies, spirits, etc., etc. Women are also treated in a very particular way in Gothic literature. More often than not, they're pictured in extreme distress to match the heightened drama of the story, or they're being threatened by evil, tyrannical men. Usually, this works to line up with both the gender roles of the pre Victorian era, when the Gothic lit movement was at its peak, and to line up with the themes of the works themselves. Because Gothic literature gained popularity during a really difficult time for most people, the theming reflects this, with topics like madness, isolation, power and control, revenge, and death really popular within the genre. Many of these themes are also really common within the late 2000s horror games we were talking about earlier. Well, there are a lot of similarities between these characteristics and horror games from that 2000s period I was talking about earlier. Some of the games are even perfect shoo-ins for Gothic horror, like Rule of Rose, a story about this girl exploring this flying steampunk type of castle, while also diving into the memories of her childhood and the trauma of being bullied in an orphanage while she was younger. American McGee's Alice games are also nearly a perfect example, except Alice explores this dreamy but ruined wonderland as she unpacks her own family trauma after they all die in a fire. Both have the main characters going in and out of flashbacks and memories, and victimize women both within the cast of characters and as protagonists themselves. Other video games, on the other hand, are more modern adaptations like the Silent Hill series. Silent Hill 2 especially feels like a modern Gothic story since it's an allegory for the grief, depression, and guilt of the protagonist James Sunderland after the loss of his late wife, but with horrific metaphors like the zombie creatures following him around. However, this trend in 2000s horror games aren't just direct copies of what made Gothic literature so famous. They also brought a lot of unique features to revitalize the genre in their own right. Many of the games combine it with other elements like childhood fairy tales in Alice and Rule of Rose, or Japanese horror like in Forbidden Siren and Fatal Frame. The first is a story with an ensemble cast about a small town riddled with an infection that turns its townspeople into monsters that are inspired by Japanese folklore and horror. Fatal Frame, on the other hand, draws a lot of influence from Japanese customs and beliefs, specifically relating to Shinto and Japanese Buddhism. It adds a new element to Gothic horror that makes it feel fresh while still staying loyal to the elements that made the genre so beloved in the first place. Meanwhile, the way Gothic stories are organized and told, in this eerie but dreamy, not quite sensical way, make it perfect for the plot twists that often come with psychological horror games, like James and Mary in Silent Hill 2. No spoilers, though. Using Gothic horror techniques in horror games overall makes the stories within them way more memorable and immersive, especially compared to more modern horror games. This is because the horror aspects are based on human experience. Grief, guilt, growing up, cruelty, it's all way more captivating than just relying on jump scares. This is especially true when video games let the audience interact with the environment as much as possible, way more than you could with writing back during the original Gothic movement. The video game medium and Gothic storytelling are pretty much a perfect match for each other, but specifically following the literary movement is not the core reason as to why these games are so well written, or even just so well loved in general. So, how do you think these games keep their adoring fans even decades after their release? My personal theory why these games feel so timeless, despite the fact that some are 20, even pushing 30 years old at this point, is that they have cohesive themes that still relate to people nowadays. They didn't solely rely on passing trends like the dozens of mascot horror, stalker horror, and anomaly games nowadays, but they based their horror on something emotional instead. I'm a big fan of plenty of these current games, and I have been for years, but there hasn't been a single time when the writing and stories from them specifically stood out to me. For most of these games, once you figure out the main plot, the substance underneath is pretty thin and generic, whether it's a cafe barista being stalked, or a security guard monitoring anomalies, or animatronics in creepy buildings. Taking inspiration from Gothic horror or any artistic movement that speaks to you, it can really help build overall cohesion in your writing. Writers can build on top of these themes to really connect with audiences in the way that sticks. For example, Silent Hill 2 is purely about grief and guilt, and you can tell this just from any isolated part of the game, from the setting to the character development to the plot itself. The foggy abandoned town, save for the weird zombies, occasional strangers, and Pyramid Head, help build that isolating feeling that James is experiencing in his depression. Meanwhile, almost every character he interacts with reflects some part of his experience with his late wife. For example, Maria is a representation of the parts of Mary he resented, and the nurses are the guilt and sexual repression that he felt while she was still sick. Pyramid Head is his inner longing for punishment for how he treated her and how things ended up. One of the best parts about these games is that nearly any of them could be adapted to novels to really match the Gothic horror genre, and they'd be just as good as their video game versions. That's what makes the writing strong. But overall, the link between Gothic horror culture and its influence on 2000s horror games is undeniable once you notice the connection. Even though the trend has now passed, the way creators used themes based in the human experience have turned these games into timeless classics. And that's what makes the Gothic horror genre so enduring in video games, books, and history. So, thank you so much for watching. I'm just starting out with making my own video essays, so I'd love to hear any feedback you have on how to make these videos better. If you liked this breakdown, please leave a like or subscribe, as I have plenty of videos planned to come out really soon. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Gothic genre or horror games in general, so feel free to comment below, and you can check out my next video for more deep dives of my favorite media.